Sure. Here is a more detailed version of Ronald's morning routine, including additional activities and questions in simple present tense. Ronald's morning routine. What time does Ronald wake up? Ronald wakes up at 6 a.m. What does Ronald do after he wakes up? He stretches and does some light exercises. What exercises does Ronald do? He does yoga and some push-ups. What does Ronald do after exercising? He takes a shower. What does Ronald do after his shower? He gets dressed for the day. What does Ronald wear to work? He wears a suit and tie. What does Ronald do after getting dressed? He makes his bed. What does Ronald do after making his bed? He goes to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. What does Ronald eat for breakfast? He eats ham and eggs. What does Ronald drink for breakfast? He drinks coffee. Where does Ronald eat breakfast? He eats breakfast at home. Who makes breakfast for Ronald? His wife makes breakfast for him. Why does Ronald eat breakfast? Because food gives him energy. What does Ronald do after he eats breakfast? He brushes his teeth. What does Ronald do after he brushes his teeth? He goes for a short walk. Where does Ronald go for a walk? He walks around his neighborhood. Who does Ronald meet during his walk? He meets his neighbor, Mr. Smith. What do Ronald and Mr. Smith talk about? They talk about their gardens. What does Ronald do after his walk? He reads the newspaper. Where does Ronald read the newspaper? He reads it in his living room. What section of the newspaper does Ronald read first? He reads the sports section first. What does Ronald do after reading the newspaper? He waters his plants. Why does Ronald water his plants? Because they need water to grow. What does Ronald do after watering his plants? He checks his emails. Where does Ronald check his emails? He checks them on his computer in the home office. What does Ronald do after checking his emails? He packs his bag for work. What does Ronald put in his bag? He puts his laptop, documents, and lunch in his bag. What does Ronald do after packing his bag? He leaves the house and walks to the bus stop. What bus does Ronald take to work? He takes the city bus to work. What does Ronald do on the bus? He listens to music and reads a book. What book does Ronald read on the bus? He reads a mystery novel. What does Ronald do after he arrives at work? He greets his colleagues and starts his workday. What is Ronald's job? He is an accountant. What does Ronald do during his workday? He attends meetings, works on financial reports, and answers emails. What does Ronald do during his lunch break? He eats his lunch and takes a short walk outside. What does Ronald do after his lunch break? He continues working until the end of the day. What time does Ronald finish work? He finishes work at 5 p.m. What does Ronald do after work? He takes the bus back home and spends the evening with his family. I hope this detailed version helps. If you have any more questions or need further details, feel free to ask.